Welcome to H360 Health Talk. We're here today with John Lehr, the CEO of the Parkinson's Foundation, which is committed to making life a better place for people living with Parkinson's by funding the largest network of comprehensive clinical care centers worldwide, serving as the leading funder of training for neurologists who specialize in Parkinson's disease, and conducting the largest ever clinical trial of Parkinson's. For those of you who don't know, April is Parkinson's Awareness Month, and I'm very honored to be here with John. John, thanks for coming in.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
So, John, tell us. Let's start by telling us a little about your background and
Sure.
how you ended up at the Parkinson's Foundation.
Yeah. Oh, thank you very much for asking. I've been in healthcare my whole professional life. I started out at the University of Pennsylvania many years ago, working in database research in the medical school, and then gradually moved up into different roles, initially on the fundraising side and more recently on the management side. So I've been on the management side for the last 10 years and have worked in what I would describe as disease-specific organizations for the better part of those last 10 years.
Yep. Now, many people that I talk to that are executive directors or CEOs of foundations have somewhat of a personal connection. Is there
Sure.
a personal connection to Parkinson's for you?
Yeah, so going back to my childhood, we all have grandmothers and grandfathers, and then we have unofficial grandmothers and grandfathers. So one of my unofficial grandmothers was diagnosed with Parkinson's, and this was a family we used to have Thanksgiving with every year. So I got to know her very well, obviously, and when she was diagnosed with Parkinson's, it stayed with me. And then when I was contacted by a recruiter to come to the Parkinson's Foundation, it felt like a natural place for me to go, given what I knew about the disease from when I was a kid.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about the foundation and the history of it.
So what's really interesting about Parkinson's Foundation is that it really has been around since 1957. In 2016, there was a merger of two smaller organizations, one based in New York City and one based in Miami. Both of them were, interestingly enough, founded in 1957. They coexisted for many years. They probably competed with each other for probably the last 10 to 15 years. And then they finally decided, for the good of the community, to come together as one organization. That merger was effected in 2016. I was recruited in the fall of that year and then began at the Parkinson's Foundation in January of 2017.
So what are some of the biggest challenges facing the community?
Yeah, so Parkinson's is a really complex disease. If most people will go to Wikipedia and look it up, and what it'll say is that it's a neurological disorder that will often affect people's movement. That is very much true. However, what we've learned over the last couple of decades through a greater understanding of the disease is how complex it is and how multi-system it is. That is that it doesn't just affect your movement. It's not just simply a neurological disease. There are cognitive issues. There are mental health issues. There are GI issues. There are sensory issues. Actually, one of the early signs of Parkinson's is the loss of sense of smell. There are sleep deprivation issues. People with Parkinson's have a tendency to have a hard time sleeping. So it's a very complex disease that requires a lot of different solutions to it.
So does the foundation focus on a few of those, or do they focus on the condition holistically?
Yeah, holistically. So there are a number of areas where we really are quite focused. One is improving care for people with Parkinson's to ensure that people have the best outcomes once they have a diagnosis with Parkinson's, so that they can do their activities of daily living, they can have a high quality of life, and to the extent possible that they can continue to live where they've always lived, in the place that they call home. We also fund research, so we fund both clinical research looking at patient outcomes. We fund epidemiological research looking at the prevalence, the incidence, the economic burden of Parkinson's. And also we fund basic research. What do I mean by basic research? We fund what's called what is considered the underlying causes of the disease. Why is Parkinson's happening in your body? Why, is it starting in your stomach? Is it starting in your brain? What are the cellular or mechanistic issues that are going on that's causing your Parkinson's diagnosis to get worse over time? So we're looking at all of those important research issues with the goal of improving our understanding so that we can develop both clinical treatments and medical treatments ultimately that will either prevent, stop, or ultimately cure people with Parkinson's.
So when we look at some conditions like breast cancer, there's BRCA,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Sure.
Or we look at colon cancer and there's Lynch. Is
Sure.
there a genetic mutation that can be identified that relates to Parkinson's?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So within the last, I would say, 2 decades, we have understood Parkinson's to have a genetic component. So there are 20 plus genes that are implicated in Parkinson's. 2 in particular have a stronger correlation with diagnosis. That said, you could have all of those genes and not develop Parkinson's. So it's not purely a deterministic, genetics are not purely deterministic in a diagnosis of Parkinson's. So what else is in play? Clearly the environment is in play. And so there's some interaction between the environment and genetics that can trigger a diagnosis of Parkinson's. But we don't know it yet, frankly.
So when you say environment, give me an example of what you're
Well,
referring
so there are some pesticides that have been used,
Sure.
like paraquat, which is no longer used, that had a connection to a diagnosis of Parkinson's. There do seem to be areas of the country where, in more rural areas, where they may have used agricultural agents that have ticked up the prevalence of Parkinson's in those areas. So we're sensitive to those, obviously, and where we can, we've advocated for the prohibition of those toxins.
Yeah. So how does the condition begin to present itself?
Yeah.
Most people think of Parkinson's and you think of the tremor.
Yeah.
Is that usually the case, or are there other signs that you should get looked at?
Yeah, so it usually the first thing that people see is usually the tremor, what we call a resting tremor. It's where your arm or your hand will start to shake. Sometimes it's your leg. Usually that's a first sign. Another sign is, as I mentioned earlier, it's a sense of smell. People will often lose their sense of smell and not be aware of why they're losing their sense of smell. So those are early indications. But as time goes on, there tend to be other signs and symptoms that may come into play. But what we know is that people often have Parkinson's a number of years before they're actually diagnosed. They'll start to notice some symptoms, and then eventually they'll find their way. It can be up to 5 years. In fact, I was talking with a young woman, very unusual case. She's 33 years old, and she has early onset Parkinson's, which is fairly uncommon. Less than 10% of people will develop early onset Parkinson's. But she started noticing a tremor in her hand when she was 22 years old, and then it began to progress, and then she finally went and got diagnosed.
My mother's an Alzheimer's patient, and I'm really disturbed of the lack of progress
Sure.
we've made in that area of Alzheimer's to find a cure. Talk to me a little about some of the leading edge research that's going on, and what are you seeing there?
Yeah, so as I said earlier, Parkinson's is a very complex disease, and there are some basic questions that we're still asking. As I mentioned earlier, there is a protein that's implicated in Parkinson's. It's called alpha-synuclein, and it doesn't fold properly, or it misfolds. But one of the questions is, does this problem with alpha-synuclein, does it begin in your stomach, in your gut, or does it begin in your brain? It's an interesting question because therapies targeted toward the gut are different than therapies targeted toward the brain. Any disease that affects the brain, like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, is challenging in and of itself. The brain is really complex, but there's this thing called the blood-brain barrier. And so when you're trying to develop therapies, those therapies have to be small enough to cross the blood-brain barrier. So the body does a very good job of keeping pathogens out of the brain. But one of the side effects of that is it's not easy to sometimes introduce therapies into the brain. So that's part of the reason why there's been let's say, less progress in Alzheimer's or in Parkinson's than in some other diseases, like the cancers that you can introduce therapies in an easier way in some cases.
Mm-hmm. One of the big things now I'm reading about are these things called biosimilars.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see biosimilars beginning to play a role or coming into into view here for Parkinson's?
So tell me a little bit more about what you mean by biosimilars.
Well, so there's an oral solid and then there's a biologic, right?
Sure.
And they both go off patent at a certain time, and
Yes.
then can be duplicated. Right?
Yeah.
So most likely a biologic is an injectable,
Sure.
administered in a clinical setting.
Sure. Yeah, what I would say is in Parkinson's, the challenge we have is we really have one frontline therapy, medical therapy, and it's called levodopa carbidopa.
Which has been around for a while.
Been
right?
around. It was
Yeah.
initially discovered in the 1960s
Right.
and developed into a therapy in the 70s. It is the main treatment for most people with Parkinson's. There's a surgical treatment, deep brain stimulation,
Right.
And then there are a number of therapies that use to control symptoms like dementia and other things like depressives. Really the number of therapies available to people with Parkinson's is still fairly limited, and that's part of what we're trying to do. So in terms of other ingestibles and things like that, we're not far enough down the road to really be able to say with any degree of satisfaction that they're going to be effective for people with Parkinson's.
Now, is the deep brain stimulation for more the severe cases?
So it's really interesting. If it's not necessarily for people who have more severe cases. It's really often a matter of when you're talking with your clinician will want to assess whether or not your cognitive state has been affected already. So deep brain stimulation tends to be a therapy that you use on people who don't have as much cognitive involvement. And so it is a viable solution for people. Some people are very fearful of having electrodes in their brain for obvious reasons. Some people do well on levodopa, so decide to stay on levodopa. But a number of people who get deep brain stimulation have terrific benefits from the movement aspects of the disease. Yeah. It doesn't necessarily stop Parkinson's. It doesn't stop Parkinson's. Parkinson's progresses. But it can really control some of the movement issues that people face.
So John, April is Parkinson's Awareness Month. What are some of the things that you're doing to bring, shine the spotlight? I know you're here talking with me today.
Yeah.
What are some of the other things that you're doing to shine the spotlight on Parkinson's?
So one of our big initiatives during April, Parkinson's Awareness Month, is to start a conversation about Parkinson's. Parkinson's is a disease that affects 1 million Americans and 10 million individuals worldwide. It's a disease primarily of people who are older. The average age of diagnosis is in the early 60s. It's a disease that people don't like to talk about often. People are sometimes embarrassed. There's a lot of stigma associated with the disease. Some people, quite frankly, are just fearful of losing employment because of a perception that they wouldn't be able to do their jobs. So some of this gets pushed underground, and what we want to do is to say, look, let's have a conversation about Parkinson's. Let's talk about it openly. Let's get it out, because we believe that with the right treatment, the right therapies, seeing clinicians who are well versed in the issues of Parkinson's, you can lead a really good quality of life. And that particularly if you're active and exercising and on a good medical regimen, you can live 20 plus years with Parkinson's and live life to the fullest. And so we want people to understand that side of Parkinson's. Yes, it is a challenging disease for sure, but the more we talk about it, the less stigma will be attached to it.
Yeah. Talk to me about the caregiver. In some of these conditions like Parkinson's and many cancers, the caregiver plays such an important role in the overall quality of life, both medically, spiritually, intellectually, sexually, right? There's all of this, it kind of gets wrapped in that. What's there for the caregiver?
Yeah, that's great. So I agree with you. Often the diagnosis of Parkinson's, clearly it can be devastating for the person who has been diagnosed, but is often equally devastating for their spouse, their partner, their boyfriend, girlfriend, and those individuals often get transitioned into a caregiver or care partner role. and then are expected to be helpful in doing things for the person with Parkinson's that they may not have initially thought when they started the relationship that they were going to end up in that situation. And so what we try to do for people who are care partners is provide as much education as we can, whether that's through our print materials, our website materials, which can be found at parkinson.org, or by calling our helpline, which is 1-800 4PD info. So all of those resources are available to care partners, but we also go another step. We will often, in any given year, hold what we call a caregiver summit, and bring people together to talk about how they're navigating a diagnosis with Parkinson's for a loved one, the strategies and tactics that they're taking to make sure that not only are they helping their partner who has Parkinson's, but taking care of themselves, which is really an important thing, because if you're going down and you're unable to take care of yourself, you're not going to be able to take care of your partner. So we are really all about giving people the tools that they can use to stay resilient, not only for their partner, but for themselves.
So, John, if I call the 800 number, or a patient or a caregiver or care partner calls the 800 number,
Sure.
What can they expect to hear on the other end of the line?
Well, what they're going to hear is from a trained individual, somebody who has great experience, and most of our folks are clinicians in one way or another, whether a nurse or a social worker or a PT. So they're going to call somebody who has professional trainings, professional expertise, but has also been fielding calls from people with Parkinson's and their care partners for many, many years. And what they'll hear is a sympathetic voice on the other end, somebody who's going to help work through their issues, their challenges, provide them with access to resources that they can use that are going to let them navigate through their daily life and their daily journey with Parkinson's.
So you said your website was parkinsons.org?
It's Parkinson.
Parkinson.org.
No S on the end, no apostrophe, just Parkinson.org.
Okay. And so if I go there, can I find things in my local area? Can I find a local chapter, or the spring, right? Well, it snowed yesterday,
Sure.
but the spring is supposed to be here.
Yeah.
And now we're all getting out and walking and fundraising
Sure.
and building awareness. Can I find those local activities
Absolutely. We have a place where you can go and type in what's going on in my community, and it'll populate all the things that are happening in your backyard. We also have a navigation map where you can go and find walks that are taking place in your community. So it's a brand new website. We just revised it since the merger. It's easy to navigate. It's designed so that people with Parkinson's can get around it easily, because it's bigger print and it's easier to read, and those types of things, so that yes, it has a world of resources for anybody to not only find out globally, but also in your own backyard.
And John, I'm assuming that your new website has a donate button, so when I go on after our visit today, I can contribute to your cause?
Absolutely. Right at the top it says donate, and I think it's in a yellow or orange color, so it stands out.
It stands out. I know a lot of celebrities. I think it's Ernie Els is very active, a pro golfer in
Sure,
Parkinson's,
of course.
right? He holds an annual golf outing. Are you guys involved in that in any way?
We're not involved with Ernie Els, but we are involved with a number of other folks who are prominent in Parkinson's. We get a lot of support from different people. Just like what Ernie Els does, and Neil Diamond recently was diagnosed with Parkinson's. That all helps to elevate the awareness of the disease, and obviously Michael J. Fox is well known as a face of Parkinson's and how to persevere in the face of a very difficult diagnosis. And we celebrate those stories of people who are prominent. We celebrate the stories of everyday people who are living with this disease.
Attitude has so much to play in this, right? Yeah. A positive attitude leads to better outcomes. People say that. What are some of the things that you find can almost levitate, if you will, the situation?
Yeah, so I would say talk about your disease, be open about your disease. The other thing I'd say is get out there and exercise. Do whatever you can. I mean, for people without a disease, exercise brings endorphins that always makes everybody feel good. For people with Parkinson's, it's really critical. We've got research that demonstrates that exercise, maybe beyond levodopa or some other therapies, is as important as anything that you can do to stay on the right side of Parkinson's. The endorphins that come from it, the interaction that you have. A lot of our people will participate in boxing classes or dance classes or Tai Chi. They do things that they've never done before and would have thought of doing before, and it has the added benefit of having some neuroprotective qualities to it, but it also has the ability to bring them out of their house, get them involved. And we say, what's the best exercise to do? It's the exercise that's right for you, the exercise that you're going to do every day. And if it's simply sitting in your chair and raising your arms and, going through some shadow boxing, we encourage that as well.
Yeah. Well, John, thanks for stopping by.
Oh, it was my pleasure.
I really appreciate it, and keep up the good work.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.